October 25, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea. The sky bleeds pink and orange across a quiet horizon. 6 escort carriers steam in lazy circles off the island of Samar, their engines humming low. Pilots sip coffee on flight decks. Mechanics check oil lines. A radio crackles somewhere below. And then a lookout freezes. He raises his binoculars. His breath catches. On the horizon, shapes, big shapes, pagoda masts, the silhouette of something that should not be here. A voice cuts through the morning calm. Enemy surface force bearing 040. On the bridge of the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort barely 300 feet long, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland stares through his binoculars at the largest battleship in the world. The Yamato, 18-inch guns, 70,000 tons of steel, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And she is closing fast. What happens next will defy every rule of naval warfare and redefine what courage looks like. 3 weeks earlier, Allied forces stood on the edge of liberating the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur had promised to return. On October 20, 1944, he waded ashore at Leyte Gulf, cameras rolling, fulfilling that promise. Behind him, the largest naval invasion force in Pacific history began pouring men and material onto Philippine soil. But MacArthur's landing was only possible because of the U.S. Navy's dominance at sea. And that dominance was about to be tested like never before. Japan knew the Philippines were the key. Lose them, and the home islands would be cut off from fuel, rubber, and rice flowing up from Southeast Asia. The Imperial Japanese Navy devised a plan, complex, desperate, and brilliantly deceptive. It was called Sho-Go 1, Operation Victory. The Japanese split their remaining fleet into 3 forces. The Northern Force, built around Japan's last carriers, now nearly empty of planes, would sail down from the north as bait. The goal? Lure away Admiral William Bull Halsey and his powerful Third Fleet, the muscle of American naval power in the Pacific. Meanwhile, 2 surface forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from the west. Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Southern Force would push through Surigao Strait from the south, and the center force, the Hammer, would thread through the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the American landing beaches from the north. The center force was commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. It was a weapon forged from Japan's last strength. 4 battleships, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. On paper, it was unstoppable. On October 24th, American carrier planes found Kurita's fleet in the Sibuyan Sea. On paper, it was unstoppable. On October 24th, American carrier planes found Kurita's fleet in the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave pounded the formation. The Musashi, sister to the Yamato, absorbed an estimated 19 torpedo hits and 17 bombs before capsizing. Over 1,000 men went down with her. Kurita turned away. Admiral Halsey, tracking the battle from his flagship, concluded the center force was broken and retreating. Then his scouts found the Japanese carriers to the north. The bait. Halsey made his decision. He took his entire fleet, every battleship, every fast carrier, and steamed north to destroy them. He left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. No one told the men off Samar. Through the night of October 24th, Kurita's battered fleet limped westward, then reversed course. His remaining ships passed through the strait in darkness. American patrol planes missed them. Reconnaissance failed. The moonless night swallowed them whole. By dawn on October 25th, Admiral Kurita's center force had turned the corner of Samar Island and was steaming south, undetected, toward the American invasion fleet. Standing between them and MacArthur's beachhead were three groups of escort carriers. Small, slow, lightly armed ships known by their radio call signs: Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Taffy 3, the northernmost group, consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. One of those destroyer escorts was the USS Samuel B. hull number DE-413. She had been in commission for just 5 months. Destroyer escorts were not built to fight battleships. They were built to hunt submarines. Cheap, fast to produce, and small enough to screen convoys across the Atlantic. The Samuel B. displaced 1,350 tons, about 1/50th the weight of the Yamato. She was 306 feet long, powered by 2 turbines, pushing 12,000 horsepower. Top speed? 24 knots on a good day. Her armament reflected her role: 2 5-inch guns, 1 forward and 1 aft, 3 twin 40mm anti-aircraft mounts, depth charges, 3 torpedo tubes, her only real punch against a surface ship. She carried a crew of 224 men. Most were young. Many had never seen combat. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, was 33 years old. A 1931 Naval Academy graduate, he had spent much of his early career in unglamorous billets, fitting for a service still expanding desperately to meet the demands of global war. He was steady, disciplined, and deeply protective of his crew. Copeland drilled them hard: damage control, gunnery, engineering. He walked the deck plates, learned their names, made them believe in the ship. He had no illusions about what a destroyer escort could do against a heavy warship, but he trusted his men, and they trusted him. Taffy 3 was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton "Ziggy" Sprague, no relation to the famous Admiral Raymond Spruance. Clifton Sprague was a naval aviator, a calm and capable leader who had worked his way up through carrier command. His flagship was the escort carrier USS Samuel B. Escort carriers, jeep carriers, or baby flat tops, were converted merchant hulls topped with short flight decks. They were slow, thin-skinned, and carried just 28 aircraft each. They launched anti-submarine patrols, supported ground troops, and ferried planes. They were not meant to face surface guns. On the morning of October 25th, Taffy 3 steamed in a lazy circle about 50 miles east of Samar. The 6 carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay, turned into the wind to launch the Dawn Air Patrol. Screening them were 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, Hoel, Heermann, and Johnston. Larger and more powerful than destroyer escorts, the Fletchers carried 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedo tubes each. And then the 4 destroyer escorts: Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond. Together, Taffy 3 displaced less tonnage than the battleship Yamato alone. At 0645 hours, lookouts on the Fanshawe Bay spotted anti-aircraft bursts on the horizon to the northwest. Odd. No American forces were supposed to be there. Then the silhouettes appeared, tall, heavy, unmistakable. At 0647, Admiral Sprague received the sighting report that changed everything. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, bearing 040, distance 20 miles, closing at 30 knots. For a moment, silence held the radio. Sprague's first thought, recorded later in interviews, was disbelief. Halsey's battleships were supposed to be guarding the strait. This had to be a mistake. But the shapes grew larger. At 6:48, Sprague gave the order. Air plot, launch everything. Get every plane in the air, arm them with whatever you've got. He turned his carriers east, into the wind, toward a rain squall forming on the horizon. Smoke generators kicked on. The destroyers and destroyer escorts moved to form a screen between the carriers and the oncoming enemy. And the Samuel B. Roberts, smallest and slowest of the escorts, began laying smoke and preparing for a battle no one thought she could survive. Below decks on the Samuel B. Roberts, men moved with practiced urgency. In the forward engine room, Chief Machinist's mate Harold "Tuck" Smith spun valve wheels and watched steam pressure climb. The turbines screamed. The deck vibrated under his boots. Smith had grown up in rural Texas, joined the Navy to escape the dust, and now found himself coaxing every ounce of power from machinery that was already redlined. He would keep the engines running no matter what. In the forward 5-inch gun mount, gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr took his position as mount captain. Carr was 24, from Oklahoma, soft-spoken and deeply religious. He had trained his crew obsessively. Loading drills, firing drills, speed and rhythm. They could get off 15 rounds per minute if everything went right. Carr believed in precision. He believed his gun could make a difference. In the pilot house, Lieutenant Commander Copeland stood calm, hands on the rail, watching the horizon. He gave orders in a steady voice. No panic, no hesitation. He had read the same gunnery tables as everyone else. He knew what 18-inch shells did to thin-skinned ships. He also knew what running would mean. The carriers couldn't outrun battleships. If the destroyers didn't buy time, the entire task unit and the men on those carriers would die. He keyed the intercom and spoke to the crew. "This'll be a fight against overwhelming odds. We're going in. Give them hell." There was no drama in his voice, just fact. Below, men strapped on life jackets, crossed themselves, or stared at photographs tucked into lockers. Some cracked jokes, others went quiet. They did not consider themselves heroes. They were farm boys, city kids, men who'd worked in garages or grocery stores before the war. They had joined because the country called, trained because they were told to, and now they would fight because the man next to them was fighting. That was enough. The ships closing on Taffy 3 represented the last offensive strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Leading them was the Yamato, 72,000 tons fully loaded, 9 18-inch guns in 3 turrets. Each shell weighed 3,200 pounds and could pierce 16 inches of armor at 20 miles. Her belt armor was 16 inches thick, her deck armor 6 inches. She had been designed to fight multiple American battleships at once and win. Behind her came the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, each displacing over 30,000 tons, each mounting 14-inch guns. The heavy cruisers Tone, Chikuma, Haguro, and Chokai added 8-inch rifles to the barrage. 11 destroyers screened the formation. Together, Admiral Kurita commanded a fleet that outgunned Taffy 3 by a factor of 10-to-1 in firepower, and far more in armor and speed. The Samuel B. Roberts had 2 5-inch guns. Effective range, 10 miles in perfect conditions. The shells weighed 55 pounds. They were designed to damage unarmored submarine conning towers and aircraft. Against a battleship's armor, they would do almost nothing. The Roberts' only real weapon was her torpedoes. 3 Mark 15 torpedoes, 21 inches in diameter, each carrying 825 pounds of TNT. Effective range, about 6 miles at high speed. But to get a good firing solution, she would need to close to within 5,000 yards, just over 2.5 miles, of ships that could kill her from 15 miles away. The math was brutal. The mission, suicidal. But Copeland had one advantage the Japanese did not expect. He had no intention of playing defensively. On the bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Kurita stared at the American ships through his binoculars. He had been awake for 2 days. The air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea had shattered his nerves. He had watched the Musashi die, seen cruisers crippled, felt the concussions of near misses shake his flagship. He had turned away, then turned back, driven by duty and desperation. Now, through the haze and smoke, he saw flight decks. Kurita believed he had stumbled upon Halsey's main carrier force. It was a catastrophic misidentification. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 looked nothing like fleet carriers, smaller, slower, built on merchant frames. But in the confusion, the smoke, and Kurita's exhaustion, the silhouettes merged into what he expected to see. He gave the order, "General attack!" It was not a coordinated plan. It was a signal for every ship to engage independently, to chase down and destroy the enemy. In the chaos, Japanese ships scattered, each captain seeking targets of opportunity. Kurita's fatigue, his losses, and his flawed perception would cost him the decisive coordination that might have annihilated Taffy 3 in minutes. But his guns were still real, and they opened fire at 06:59 hours. The first salvo fell 200 yards astern of the White Plains. Columns of water, towering and white, erupted into the air. The dye markers, red, green, yellow, stained the sea, helping Japanese spotters track their fall of shot. The shells produced a sound unlike anything the Americans had heard. A freight train roar, growing louder, then the geysers and the shock. Admiral Sprague's carriers began a desperate run to the east, chasing the rain squall. Smoke poured from their stacks and from the destroyers laying chemical fog. But the Japanese were faster, and the distance closed. The first mission of the Samuel B. Roberts and her sister escorts was to disappear the carriers. Smoke generators, chemical tanks mounted on the fantail, belched thick white fog. The wind was light, the smoke hanging low across the water. The small ships wove between the carriers and the enemy, creating a curtain. It was effective. Japanese optical rangefinders struggled. Salvos fell wild, scattered by guesswork. But it was not enough. At 07:16, Admiral Sprague made the hardest decision of his life. He ordered the destroyers to attack. Not to feint, not to harass, to charge. Commander Ernest E. Evans, captain of the destroyer Johnston, did not wait for the order to be repeated. His ship had already opened fire at maximum range. Now he turned west, toward the enemy fleet, and called for flank speed. The Hoel and Heermann followed. These were not large ships, but they were fast, and their captains were aggressive. The 3 destroyers punched through their own smoke and raced toward the Japanese cruisers at over 30 knots, weaving, dodging shells, firing as they closed. The Roberts was not part of that first wave. She was slower. Her orders were to continue screening. But Lieutenant Commander Copeland watched the destroyers disappear into the smoke and the gunfire, and he knew what came next. Wars are not won by fairness. They are won by men willing to trade their lives for time. Taffy 3's aircraft were in the air, Avengers and Wildcats armed with bombs, rockets, depth charges, anything the deck crews could hang on a hard point. Some planes had no ammunition at all. They made dry runs anyway, diving on Japanese ships to distract gunners, to break formations, to buy seconds. Pilots emptied their guns, then flew back to carriers that were under fire, landed on decks pitching in evasive turns, rearmed by hand, and went up again. They were heroic. But planes alone could not stop battleships. The carriers could not outrun the enemy. They could not outfight them. Their only hope was that the destroyers and the destroyer escorts would delay the Japanese long enough for help to arrive, or for a miracle. Admiral Sprague did not believe in miracles, but he believed in his sailors. At 0730, he gave the order to the destroyer escorts, "Small boys, attack!" It was the calmest suicide order ever issued. On the bridge of the Samuel B. Roberts, Copeland acknowledged the command. He turned to his officer of the deck and said, "All ahead flank." Left full rudder, steer for the cruisers. Then he picked up the intercom and addressed the crew one more time. "We're going in. We're going to fire our torpedoes and then use our guns for as long as we can. I know this seems hopeless, but we're all that stands between those carriers and the Japanese. So we fight." His voice was still calm. Below, men tightened straps and gripped steel, and the Samuel B. Roberts turned into the teeth of the enemy fleet. The Roberts accelerated to 23 knots, every turbine screaming, every rivet shaking. She was not alone. The destroyer escorts Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond had also received the order. Together, the 4 small ships broke from the smoke and began their run. Ahead, the sea erupted. Japanese cruisers shifted fire. Salvos walked toward the charging escorts. 8-inch shells howled overhead. Near misses threw columns of water as high as the mast. Copeland ordered the helm to zigzag. Hard rudder changes every 30 seconds, just enough to spoil the enemy's firing solution without losing too much speed. The forward 5-inch gun opened fire. Paul Carr and his crew worked like a machine. Load, fire, eject. Load, fire. The mount bucked with each shot. Brass casings clattered on the deck. Range? 18,000 yards. Impossible range. But Carr kept firing. Cordite smoke filled the mount. The barrel grew hot. The Roberts closed to 15,000 yards, then 12,000. Shells bracketed her. One landed 50 feet to starboard. The blast wave rolled the ship. Shrapnel pinged off the hull. Copeland did not flinch. He stood on the open bridge, watching the enemy, calling corrections. At 10,000 yards, the Roberts was inside effective torpedo range. Copeland gave the order, "Stand by to fire torpedoes." The torpedo officer, Ensign Jack Usen, crouched by the triple-tube launcher amidships. He trained the tubes on the nearest heavy cruiser, likely the Chikuma, and waited for the solution. The ship shuddered. Another near miss. Water crashed over the bow. "Fire 1! Fire 2! Fire 3!" 3 Mark 15 torpedoes leapt from their tubes, hit the water, and began their run. White wakes streaked toward the enemy. The Samuel B. Roberts had just emptied her torpedo magazine. And now, with nothing but her 2 5-inch guns and her speed, she turned parallel to the Japanese cruisers and began the gun duel of her life. Climax/turning point. The battle dissolved into chaos. Smoke, rain squalls, and the low morning sun fractured visibility. Japanese ships maneuvered independently, chasing targets, losing formation. American carriers twisted through radical turns, launching and recovering planes while under fire. And in the center of it all, tiny destroyers and destroyer escorts traded salvos with battleships. The Johnston had already been hit. An 18-inch shell from Yamato or a 14-inch round from Congo struck her amidships, destroying one engine room and killing dozens. Her speed fell to 17 knots. She was on fire. But Commander Evans, badly wounded, his shirt blown off, covered in burns, kept fighting. The Johnston continued firing, continued closing. The Hoel pressed her attack, launching torpedoes at the battleship Congo. Japanese gunfire walked across her. Shells destroyed her bridge, blew apart her forward mounts, shredded her hull. She began to list. And the Samuel B. Roberts, her torpedoes gone, became a gun platform. Paul Carr's forward mount found its rhythm. He was firing at the heavy cruiser Chikuma 5 miles distant. The Chikuma was a formidable target, 11,000 tons, 8 8-inch guns, armored belt. Destroyer escort shells should have bounced off. But Carr aimed for the superstructure, the bridge, the gun directors, anything unarmored. His crew loaded and fired without pause, 15 rounds per minute. Then 18. The mount grew so hot that paint blistered and peeled, spent casings piled knee-deep. Range corrections came from the bridge. Copeland stood in the open, binoculars raised, calling out shifts in deflection. Shells screamed past him. He ignored them. The Roberts fired over 600 rounds from her 2 5-inch guns during the battle, more than 5 times her ready ammunition storage. Damage-controlled parties ran shells up from the magazine by hand, forming human chains, shirts soaked in sweat and powder residue. And hits began to land. Observers on other ships saw flashes on the Chikuma's superstructure. Fires started. Her rate of fire slowed. A 5-inch shell from the Roberts, or possibly the Heermann or Johnston, struck near her bridge. Another punched into a gun mount. The Chikuma began to turn away. For a moment, the impossible seemed possible. A destroyer escort was driving off a heavy cruiser. Then, the Roberts took her first hit. At 0820 hours, a 14-inch shell, likely from the battleship Congo, struck the Roberts amidships, just aft of the smokestack. It did not explode. It passed clean through the thin hull, one side to the other, like a bullet through paper, but it severed the port engine's steam line. Superheated steam screamed into the compartment. Men died instantly, scalded in the white-hot blast. Others stumbled out, skin peeling, screaming. The Roberts lost half her power. Her speed fell to 15 knots. Copeland ordered damage control teams to the engine room. Chief Machinist's mate Tuck Smith and his men climbed down into hell. Steam filled the space. The temperature exceeded 200 degrees. Visibility was 0. Smith felt his way through the fog, hands blistering on hot metal, and closed the isolation valves by touch. He saved the starboard engine. The Roberts kept moving, but she was slowing, and the Japanese were not. More shells found her. An 8-inch round from a cruiser struck the aft deckhouse, exploding inside. Shrapnel tore through crew berthing. Men who had been passing ammunition were cut down. The explosion blew open the hull plating. Water poured in. The list increased. 5 degrees, then 8. Another shell hit forward, penetrating the mess deck and detonating near the forward magazine. Only the flooding from previous damage prevented a catastrophic explosion. The Roberts was saved by the sea already drowning her. Copeland could feel the ship dying under him, but he did not order a retreat. The carriers were still in range of the Japanese guns. Every minute the Roberts stayed in the fight was another minute for them to escape. He kept firing. Paul Carr and his forward gun crew did not stop. Shells came up, shells went out. The barrel was so hot it glowed faintly red at the base. The recoil mechanism was failing, but Carr muscled the breech open manually after each shot. At 0851, another shell hit. This one struck the forward 5-inch mount directly. The explosion killed most of the crew instantly. The mount filled with fire and smoke. The ready ammunition cooked off, secondary blasts ripping through the confined space. Lieutenant Commander Copeland held his men together. He swam from group to group, told stories, reminded them of home, kept them awake. On the morning of October 27th, a Navy patrol craft spotted the clusters of rafts. One by one, the survivors were pulled aboard. Copeland was the last man to leave the water. He had kept his promise. He had brought as many home as he could. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, of which the action off Samar was one part, was the largest naval battle in history. When the guns fell silent, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been destroyed as a fighting force. 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers were sunk or crippled. Japan would never again sortie a major fleet. The Americans lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, a destroyer escort, and several smaller vessels. The tactical imbalance of the battle off Samar shocked even veteran analysts. Taffy 3, outnumbered and outgunned by a margin that should have guaranteed annihilation, had fought the Japanese to a standstill and survived. Historians still debate why Kurita withdrew. Some call it caution, others confusion. A few suggest moral exhaustion. The Admiral simply could not bring himself to continue the slaughter after watching his fleet torn apart the day before. But those who were there credit the Americans who charged. Commander Ernest Evans of the Johnston, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, had led the destroyer attack that fractured Japanese cohesion. His ship sank at 0945 after engaging targets until her last gun was silenced. The Hoel, under Commander Leon Kintberger, had fired every torpedo and over 500 rounds before capsizing. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts had fought as long and as hard as ships 3 times her size. Admiral Sprague, in his after-action report, wrote, "The performance of the screening vessels was such as to defy adequate description. They charged the enemy with such ferocity that the Japanese believed they were facing cruisers and destroyers of the first line. The Japanese cruiser Chikuma, battered by gunfire and air attack, sank later that day. The Chokai was scuttled. 3 other cruisers were heavily damaged, and the Roberts guns had contributed. Lieutenant Commander Copeland received the Navy Cross. His citation noted extraordinary heroism and aggressive determination against an overwhelmingly superior force. He never spoke of himself as a hero. In later interviews, he deflected credit to his crew. "They were just kids," he said, "farm boys and city kids. But when the time came, they did what had to be done." Paul Carr's family received his Navy Cross in a quiet ceremony. His gun mount, recovered decades later from the wreck, is displayed at the National Museum of the U.S. Navy. Visitors stop and read the plaque. Some touch the twisted steel. The survivors of the Roberts stayed in contact for the rest of their lives. They held reunions shared memories, and mourned the friends who never came home. In 1986, they gathered for the commissioning of a new Samuel B. Roberts, a guided missile frigate, hull number FFG-58. She would serve with distinction in the Persian Gulf, striking mines and fighting her own battles. The old sailors stood on the pier and watched her slide into the water. Some wept. The name lived on. There are moments in war when the math does not matter, when tonnage, armor, and firepower become abstractions, and all that remains is the human will to stand and fight. The USS Samuel B. Roberts should not have survived contact with the Japanese center force. By every measure, speed, guns, armor, she was outmatched. Her mission was tactically impossible, but she was crewed by men who understood that survival was not the only form of victory. They bought time, minutes that became hours, hours that allowed carriers to escape, planes to strike, and an entire invasion to proceed. The sailors of Taffy 3 did not win by destroying the enemy. They won by refusing to be destroyed quickly enough to matter. Courage, in that sense, is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act when fear is the only rational response. The wreck of the Roberts lies in deep water off Samar, more than 3 miles down. In 2022, explorers using submersibles located her remains. The hull is broken, the superstructure collapsed, but the forward gun mount, Paul Carr's mount, is still recognizable. The footage is silent. The sea that deep is absolute black. But the images carry weight. That small ship, lost in darkness, had once stood in the light and defied an empire. Her story endures not because she was large or modern or powerful. It endures because she was none of those things, and she fought anyway. In the end, the destroyer escort that charged a fleet proved something no manual or doctrine could teach, that the size of the fight is not determined by the size of the ship. It is determined by the size of the heart aboard her. When damage control parties reached the mount and pried open the hatch, they found Paul Carr still alive. Barely. Both his legs were gone below the knee. His abdomen was torn open. He was holding a 55-pound shell in his arms, trying to load it into the breech. He looked at the damage control officer and said, "Help me load this. We can still fire." They tried to pull him out. He refused. He kept trying to lift the shell. He died holding it. Gunner's mate, 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, would be posthumously recommended for the Medal of Honor. The Navy awarded him the Navy Cross. With the forward gun destroyed, the Roberts had only her aft mount left, and she was sinking. Water flooded the engine room. The starboard turbine, still running, began to scream as seawater touched the hot casing. Chief Smith and his men tried to stop the flooding, but the pumps were overwhelmed. The list reached 15 degrees. At 0900 hours, a final salvo from a Japanese cruiser, probably Tone or Haguro, struck the Roberts along her waterline. 3 shells in quick succession. The thin hull buckled, frames twisted, the keel itself cracked. She began to settle by the stern. Copeland gave the order he had hoped never to give. Prepare to abandon ship. The aft gun crew fired one last round, then secured the breach and climbed out. Men moved calmly, life jackets were distributed, rafts were cut loose, the wounded were carried topside. The Roberts was still under fire. Shells continued to fall around her, but she was no longer a threat. Some Japanese ships shifted targets. At 0905, Lieutenant Commander Copeland walked through the ship one last time. He checked compartments, called out for survivors, made sure no man was left behind who could still move.
In the forward mount, he found Paul Carr's body. He paused, took off his cap, then continued aft. On the fantail, the last men were sliding into the water. Copeland stepped to the rail, looked back at his ship, her bow rising, stern submerged, the paint scorched and peeling, the flag still flying, and he jumped. At 0910 hours, the USS Samuel B rolled to port and slipped beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea. She had been in the fight for 2.5 hours. She had fired every shell, every torpedo, and every ounce of defiance she possessed, and she had helped save a fleet. The water was warm. The sun climbed higher. Around the sinking position of the Roberts, 120 men floated in clusters, clinging to life rafts, debris, and each other. Oil slicks spread across the surface, dark and choking. Some men were wounded, burns, shrapnel, broken bones. Others were simply exhausted. Lieutenant Commander Copeland treaded water, counted heads, and organized the survivors into groups. He ordered them to stay together, to ration water, to keep talking. Silence meant shock. Shock meant death. They could hear the battle continuing to the south. Gunfire echoed across the water. Smoke columns rose from burning ships. But the main Japanese force was turning away. Admiral Kurita, standing on the bridge of the Yamato, had made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Despite his overwhelming advantage, despite having Taffy 3 within his grasp, he ordered a general withdrawal at 0911 hours. The reasons were complex. His fleet was scattered. American air attacks, relentless, swarming, had damaged several cruisers and inflicted a psychological toll far beyond their material effect. He still believed he was facing fleet carriers, and he feared more American forces closing from the east. He had also lost track of his mission. His goal was to destroy the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. But the ferocity of Taffy 3's defense, the smoke, the confusion, and his own exhaustion convinced him that he had already accomplished something, or that continued advance would cost too much. At 0925, he turned north, away from the carriers, away from the beachhead. Taffy 3 had survived. 4 ships had not. The destroyer escort Samuel B. was gone. The destroyers Hoel and Johnston had also sunk, battered beyond recognition, and the escort carrier Gambia Bay, hit repeatedly by cruiser fire, had capsized at 0907. But the other 5 carriers were still afloat. The invasion fleet was safe. MacArthur's troops continued to pour ashore. The battle off Samar was over. The cost was counted in blood and steel. Aboard the Roberts, 89 men had been killed in action or died of wounds. Paul Carr, Tuck Smith, and dozens of others would never go home. 120 survived, floating in the oil and wreckage, waiting for rescue. It would be 2 days before help arrived. The survivors faced thirst, exposure, and sharks. Some men, delirious from dehydration, drank seawater and slipped away. Others died quietly from internal injuries sustained in the explosions. And on the morning of October 25, 1944, those hearts were large enough to change the course of history.